Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Allison Korn, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Experiential Education at UCLA Law. And I'd like to welcome you all to our first session of 2020 for the Teaching Justice webinar series. Today, we are exploring a topic very near and dear to my heart. It is entitled Teaching Justice by Keeping Families Together. The presentation will be made by Erin Miles-Cloud, who is from the Movement for Family Power, and Bobbi Butts from Starting Over Incorporated.
Hi, I'm Layla Halas. I'm the Director of Experiential Learning at Tulane and the co-chair of CLEA's Best Practices in Pedagogy Committee. And this webinar series is a project of that committee. It's called Teaching Justice, and we try to feature a number of innovative faculty and practitioners discussing new approaches to teaching justice in the classroom. So each session we focus on different topics. Here we're talking about family justice. We've also talked about immigration, racial justice, economic justice, and the kind of intersections with current resistance movements. We have, I want to let folks know about our next session, which is going to be in March. We're going to hear from Amna Akbar and Jocelyn Simonson in Beyond the Carceral State, Critically Teaching Criminal Law and Criminal Procedure. We will keep everyone posted through listservs and also the CLEA Teaching Justice website on more information about that.
Just a few logistical notes before we begin. We want you to know that this session is being recorded, and we will post it on CLEA's Teaching Justice website, which is also where we will have all information about the full lineup of upcoming webinars for the spring and summer, including the ones that Layla just referenced. We have done our best to mute your videos and audios to ensure less distraction from our presenter. So please go ahead and keep those muted for the time being. At the end, at the conclusion of both Erin's and Bobbi's presentations, we will have some room for questions and answers. And when that's the case, you are welcome to just send a chat message over individually to Erin or Bobbi, and we will be able to take those at the conclusion of our presentation. So thanks again to everyone for joining us, and we'll turn it over to Erin and Bobbi.
Hey guys, I'm really excited to be here today. So really, thank you, Layla. Thank you, Allison, for having us. And I'm going to start the presentation, but I would actually say that Bobbi's presentation is the thrilling conclusion and kind of the star of the presentation. So I'm going to go quickly, and to the extent that there are questions, please do message me, let me know. I do have research, but I'm not going to really go deep into research. So my name is Erin Miles-Cloud. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the co-director and co-founder of Movement for Family Power. You can go to next slide. So we are, in the grand scheme of movement lawyering, and we have three really large tenets that we work on. Our overall mission is to work to end the foster system's policing and punishment of families, to create a world where dignity and integrity of all families is valued and supported, and that's our mission. We have three concrete ways that we see ourselves as lawyers to work on this. One is building out loving community with people who are working to contract the foster system. Two, raising social consciousness around the harms of the foster system and forced family separation. Three, dismantling systems that surveil and control families. And you'll notice that we have not chosen to use the word child welfare or foster care, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, but we really want you all to understand that this is not a system that has felt to be caring or protective, and we don't really also believe that it's a system that can be artificially separated into components like what is child welfare, what is child protective. From the vantage point of communities, every piece of it threatens family dissolution. Next slide. Our organization is fundamentally abolitionist, which means our theory of change, how we believe that we can best achieve those three goals, is through abolition. Abolition sometimes feels really difficult for people to digest, especially when thinking about our current foster system. And we're going to talk through that today. But what it really is a theory of change that is an agreement that the root of the system that you're trying to attack, dismantle, or change is fundamentally flawed. that to address reform, you would have to agree that the roots of the system was not steeped in racism, sexism, other types of heteronormative archetypes. It is our position, and we believe very firmly, and we hope to convince today to our audience that the system of the foster system is actually rooted in pretty wildly racist politic that is a part of American history and definitely pervades our current system. And just to focus on what Patrice Cullors wrote in the Harvard Law Review series on abolition, it's also important to understand that abolition is not just about destabilization, it's also about creating spaces to repair harm. Next slide. And also, when people challenge the notion that we should be addressing this system through abolition, I also tried to remind people that some of our greatest heroes did that. We have Marcia Jones, we have Dolores Huerta, we have Harriet Tubman. I think people that we believe really did really triumphant things in their vision. And I think that we have the duty and responsibility as people who are working in social justice to think beyond what is here, especially as a role of a lawyer, which is a very particular privilege. We understand that law is just people writing things down and never people that are the most marginalized writing things down. And so we must believe in the dream that something different is possible. Next slide. Our 3 objectives for this session, including Bobbi's session, is to really discuss the history of child welfare and why it is a social justice issue. Consider the historical oppressions and how it has developed into punitive current day practices. And then Bobbi is going to bring us home and centering the leadership of families impacted and how that is not only the most ethical way to move forward in dismantling the system, it's also the most strategic. The best information and practices are coming from people who have experienced the system, and we need to develop different systems to support that. Next slide. So you can move to the next slide. We're going to talk really about the roots of this system and why we need to be taking different tactics. Oftentimes people exempt child welfare from our analysis of carceral systems, systems that are about punishment, systems that are about caging, systems that are based on isolation. And oftentimes it's taught in curriculum in law schools, if it's taught at all, from a very child-saving perspective and not from the historical analysis that actually rendered this type of what we call reproductive stratification. And when we say reproductive stratification, it's saying that some people deserve to have children, others don't. And so therefore the access to reproduce in the same way is not something that is equal amongst all people in our society. And definitely not, and you can see that through many different lenses. And so it would be remiss for us to talk about the way that our current foster system polices and punishes families without really rooting it in slavery and genocide. So we understand that the Black female was a vessel in which our economy now still benefits. It is in North America, one of the only slave regimes that was created in Western society, where the actual birth of a child, they were born into slavery. You could not bear a child into freedom, which is really important to understand that there was, from the beginning, a eugenics movement, a religious movement, an economic movement to ensure there was a status of a Black child, a status of a Black reproduction that was segregated from that of white women. When we move into genocide, we also want to be really clear that we want to root this in Indigenous politics. And we also understand that one of the actual roots of the current foster system is the genocide of Indigenous people in our land, that the current foster system, as a non-debated fact, went into Indigenous lands and took children to, quote, tame the savage out of the Indian, to strip Native languages, to strip Native cultures, move children into boarding homes. And this was an uncontested root of the child welfare system that's often not spoken about its ramifications today. Next slide. In addition to the boarding schools, I mean, I actually hesitate to even call them boarding schools. They were places of genocide where Indigenous people were kept to rid them from their languages. We have the modern progressive movement, which was another origin of the current foster system. So you'll see on the right slide, Reverend Charles Loring Brace, who started the orphan train, which is, again, an uncontested fact of our current origins of our modern child welfare and foster system. His perspective was that if you went into communities and took children from their families, you could save the child. And so in a robust effort to quote unquote save children, he took children from what he deemed to be the dangerous classes. And the dangerous classes were immigrant communities, which he believed were families that were unable to actually parent their children. He took children who were committing quote unquote crimes of poverty by, stealing bread or panhandling, and took them to a social plot which he believed would change these children and revolutionize them, which was to let them live with Protestant white families in rural America. And so shipped them off on trains. This was the creation of our current foster system, this removal of children into placement in other family homes. These children worked for those families at very low rates. It's also a current intersection with a lot of our other laws of child exploitation, labor laws. As you can imagine, there were a lot of exploitation of those children as well, which often gets glossed over by some of the more traditional orientations of talking about the orphan train, if anyone talks about the orphan train at all. And we still have agencies, major agencies in America that don't acknowledge this history. Children's Aid Society is a major foster care agency that many of you may know in your state, but definitely in New York City is a giant foster care agency. Out of the 3 different agencies that were part of the orphan train, they're the only one that publicly acknowledges that they were a part of it on their website. And the way they acknowledge it is that they call it an ambitious and controversial social experiment. And I point this out simply to say that we are very far behind in really reckoning with why we have even created this system in the first place. And if you were to read newspapers at this time, you would get the idea that we are doing this to protect children, that we're doing this because of egregious harm that exists, and we're doing this out of the goodness of our heart and a fundamental common goal to create safe places for children. But it's difficult to reconcile that with the actual history, and it's even more difficult to do that if we haven't even confronted and situated this system within its own history, let alone the context of other histories. Next slide. So I want to just give us a brief orientation of other histories that intersect. And again, I'm not going to go deep into this, but it's incredibly important to understand the intersection between our current foster system and our welfare regime. Next slide. So to understand child welfare is also to understand that the foster care system is the largest open-ended entitlement for children that exists at this time, which is fundamentally stunning when you consider the fact that it's the prerequisite to be in the foster system is a separation of family. And a child who is living with their parent that needs state assistance can't access the same state assistance that a child who's living out of their home could access. And when we look at this juxtaposition of this open-ended entitlement program through the child welfare system with the welfare rights organizing work through the history of the last 20th century, wow, it's 2020, through the 1900s, you get a historical understanding of the way welfare rights was actually explicitly used as a way to exclude Black families from state subsidies. Next slide. And so what you will see is that in 1967, there was a grassroots movement of mothers who were accessing welfare to actually shift what was the entitlement program. That was largely unsuccessful, and I encourage people to read several articles and books about the welfare movement in the 60s for a lot of political reasons. Fundamentally, welfare was something that in the early 1900s, when really created during the New Deal, that Black mothers, Black families were categorically excluded from. In the 1960s, it was excluded from the larger civil and political agendas to increase access. It also became, when Black families were able to access it, the ways of pathologizing Black motherhood increased. And we will see that as there was this movement to where Black families actually were accessing child welfare benefits, we also see a simultaneous rise in our current child welfare politics. So in 1967, where a caseload for welfare benefits was being accessed by Black families, we start to have a major boost in what we call our current child welfare regulatory schemes. In 1973, we have what is the Capital Law Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act enacted, and we start to get the landscape for our child protective scheme that you might see today. Next slide. And so just to briefly then take us through the 80s through the end of the 90s, which again was not the greatest time for Black Americans and Indigenous Americans and Latinx Americans, we then see the history of the drug war. So we are moved from the actual origins of slavery, genocide, the root beginnings of the child-saving beginnings in the progressive era, to then the disciplinary welfare tactics that arise at the end of the 1960s, to then the war on drugs, right? And these are all really important understandings of how we have perceived what a family needs, who is actually neglecting their children, who is abusive to their children, how we have developed what has become the social safety net for families. Because what we know, the social safety net for families, to anyone who has had a family, grown up in a family, knows that things that make a family safe are access to food, housing, clothing, other types of support. So through the 80s and the 90s, we have a wave of neoliberal laws that really shift the way social services are allocated yet again using Black women, Latinx women as welfare queens to justify a real drain on our social safety nets. While initiating the Just Say No campaign, Nancy Reagan really explicitly places the Just Say No campaign, the War on Drugs campaign, on the mother who uses drugs. A lot of times we think about mass incarceration, but she makes this large speech to all of our communities, you know, at a time where we weren't sitting with 150 channels, but with 6 or 7, saying that when drugs go in to a mother, love leaves a child, and making that explicit connection between substance use and the inability to love and take care of a child. 1996, we get the scheme change again for welfare, where we drastically reduce welfare supports for families. And then 1997, we have one of the greatest shifts in child welfare, which is the Adoption Safe Families Act, which limits the amount of time that families can work to reunify with their children. And during this time, the foster system was nearly 50% filled with Black children. So it is not a way, you can't, in my opinion, and I think most people would agree, it's really difficult to understand these massive shifts in the legal landscape without really understanding who was in that system and what came before. Next slide. So I'm going to skip through this slide. You can go to the next one. You see during the 1980s through 1990s, the way we have monetized our priorities. We live in a capitalist society, which means that money talks. We know this through the songs that we sing. If we go out to a club, we hang out, we know money talks, right? It shows where our priorities are. And we judge people based on their money. And we really should be judging our government on the way that it places their money. And this graph, which shows how the government started to really, really monetize these priorities we've been talking about, which is out-of-home placement, not being at home, in the 80s through the 90s. So again, remembering this was a time where we're talking about crack moms, where we're talking about welfare queens, where we're talking about Black women not being overly fertile and not being able to take care of their children, and nearly half of our foster system is Black children. We see the funds shift away from family preservation to out-of-home placement. So the gray bar you see on the right, that's the money that was being spent on out-of-home placement. And some people might see this graph really quickly and say, okay, well, that's just because they were moving more kids. No, this is the money that was allocated to out-of-home placement, despite the amount of children that were going to be there. The black bar is the amount of money that went into family preservation. It doesn't even keep up with inflation. So the black bar says, okay, this is the money that we're going to put in for in-home services to support families, increase this open entitlement for out-of-home placements. So as you can imagine, consistent with the politic, consistent with all of the concerns, and then with the capital funding, you're going to have this boost in the foster system. Next slide. So it is clear, you can go to the next slide after this, that the combination of the effects of all these things are that we have a system that's overwhelmingly filled with low-income families, overwhelmingly filled with families of color. And as this system is increasing in its budget and increasing in its size, what is decreasing is TANF, so temporary assistance for needy families, commonly known as welfare, is drastically going down. And we know that, well, I would argue that often when we're talking about assistance for families like welfare, and we're talking about those dollars, and especially a time like right now, we're in the middle of political debates, people really connect the face of welfare to people that have to prove that they are needy enough, prove that they are good enough to get our tax money. The same is not the case for our foster system. Next slide. So again, we have this increased funding that goes into this open-ended entitlement, despite the fact that our foster system is actually not an evidence-based mechanism to protect children. I think oftentimes people assume that this is a system that is been proven to actually minimize harm to children. That's not true. It's simply a system that's been proven to be funded over the course of time, but it's actually not evidence-based to eliminate harm. The things that have actually been evidence-based ways to prevent or decrease child maltreatment are expanding access to housing, expanding access to Medicaid, increasing the minimum wage even by $1, reduce child maltreatment, increasing earned income tax credit. These types of shifts in monetization, shifts in financial priorities has actually been shown to reduce child maltreatment, and yet that is not where we're seeing the majority of our efforts go. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So again, just a reminder that what we are seeing is the greatest disproportionality for children in the system are Indigenous people, then Black African American people. And what we know is that for both those populations in particular, and Latinx families in certain communities, is that they're faring worse in this system at every decision point. They are more likely to have CPS cases called on them, more likely to not receive in-home services, least likely to be able to access community-based services, and more likely to be removed. Next slide. And we also understand that the majority of these cases are not about what we perceive to be the egregious harm. So the fatalities, the sex abuse, that's not what this system is really made up of. It's made up of 62% of neglect, substance use, housing is almost the same amount of cases as physical abuse, yet that's not at all what we hear in the media. Next slide. And so it's resulted in places like New York City that Black children are 6.3 times more likely to be reported to CPS, and Latinx children are 4.5% more likely to be reported to white children. And I think here, I want to be clear that there is a split in the literature. If you finish this presentation and you think, okay, now I'm going to start Googling who's writing about this issue, who's researching it, who's talking about it, you will find people who feel like those numbers are justified. And there really is a disagreement in the literature and a disagreement in the world. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to really talk about that explicitly. You either have to believe that these numbers are disproportionate because Black and Latinx parents and Indigenous parents are worse parents, which people believe, or that we have a lot of structural issues that we've not really reconciled. There really isn't a different premise to start from. And you will see that split. Next page. Next slide. So this is just more about different ways this is manifesting in localities. Next slide. And we see with Indigenous people that history and that legacy still lives on. So we have places like South Dakota where Indigenous children are still 11 times more likely to enter the foster system. That intergenerational harm and trauma that we have caused to families really cannot be understated. Next slide. And we've also seen the way that these tactics about pathologizing different types of parenting has really changed our legal landscape. So I know this is kind of a dry slide. It's like, this is a graph. And what this graph is showing you is the way that our policies and laws have decided to regulate and monitor pregnant people who use drugs. So the number one way that we are using our legal landscape to attack what is probably one of the most vulnerable times in someone's life, and what in other systems like our criminal legal system we have deemed to be a public health crisis, we have actually increased our legal oversight through our child abuse and neglect statutes. What that means is that we need, as practitioners, to really pay attention to these laws. These laws are not evidence-based, they're not creating mechanisms of support, and they're really being driven by the wrong people. They're being driven by lawyers, pediatricians, doctors, and not being driven by people who are actually impacted by this, that can tell you what people need in community to keep their families together. Next slide. And we see this graph really manifests in localities, right? So when we look at people with prenatal drug use, we see in a place like the Bronx that 73.7% of prenatal drug investigations have been indicated. And when we talk about, and this is over the course of time, it stays roughly around 70%. That's one of the highest levels of indication rates, which is in New York, it just means that there is some standard, some evidence to show that there is some neglect, which is incredibly difficult because New York is the state where a drug screen or a drug test should not equal neglect. But yet, we see this as a major driver. And in fact, in the Bronx, 30% of kids were being taken from their caretakers between 0 to 1 with some allegation of substance use during pregnancy. That's a very different treatment of the way that we think of the public health crisis and how to actually support people. And I want to really relate that quickly back to the roots of the war on drugs, the 80s and 90s legislation. And many people really think about this opioid epidemic as really being kind of the second wave. And while there are definitely more white people who are using opioids numerically, the second wave prosecution has rooted in the punishment systems that we have created as a result to drug use during pregnancy really come from those 80s and 90s efforts on the war on drugs. Next slide. I'm going to skip over this one. Next slide. So again, I really want to take a moment to highlight, solutions, and I'm going to really step away and step back to have Bobbi highlight some of the solutions that she is working to change. But she's not the only person out there, and she's definitely not the only group out there. There are a lot of families and people resisting the system and fighting back. So here are some places that I really hope people check out, looking at JMAC for Families. If you guys are on Twitter, please follow JMAC for Families. Every Mother is a Working Mother Network. They are part of the Poor People's Campaign. They have a chapter in Philadelphia, as well as a chapter in LA. So if you are in either of those jurisdictions, please reach out to them. Coalition for the Preservation of the Black Family is a coalition of people impacted, lawyers, practitioners working out of Texas to really do some transformative work. We have Michelle Chan, her organization is actually now California Rise, and she's out in San Francisco and Oakland. Betty's Battleground, Elizabeth Brico, is really a phenomenal journalist who's been on the front lines of writing about the intersection of substance use and pregnancy. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, who are really taking the charge of and leadership of talking about this really punitive law of ASFA. Next slide. So this is just like a quick set of resources. Since I moved pretty quickly, I really would encourage people to read Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. Often people read Dorothy Roberts, then they read Killing the Black Body, which is a tremendous formative piece of work, but they don't often read Shattered Bonds. And I think it's a really, really critical work if you are trying to endeavor to understand this child welfare system. I would also encourage people to read Dr. Kiara Bridges' The Poverty of Privacy Rights, really talking about the negotiation that people must do to engage in our welfare system, and really indicates really the inhumane ways we treat people who have to access our system, which is in deep contrast to the ways that we have treated other open entitlements like our foster system. Roots, the role of race, Entangled Roots, the role in race and policy to separate families. That's a great resource if you're just really quickly trying to find the intersections. And then Erica Miners and Charity Tolliver are really, 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 really tremendous people. I really hope that you think about the work that you're doing, especially if you are a mandated reporter. They've done some really excellent analysis, especially thinking it from a non-heteronormative lens. Next slide. So feel free to follow us on Twitter, Instagram. Our website is movementforfamilypower.org. And that's Erin Cloud is my email. Lisa Sango is my partner. And I hope that I gave some context to why this is a social justice issue. And I'm going to kick it over to Bobbi for some solutions. Oh, actually, if anyone has time, if you want to do questions, Layla, do you want to do questions now?
I think it makes sense to wait until after Bobbi, although if folks have questions, feel free to chat them to Erin or Bobbi, and we can address them, when it makes the most sense. Thanks.
Hi, hello. So family unification, equity, and empowerment, abbreviation is FREE. Next slide. So who am I? My name is Bobbi Ebony Butts. I'm a mother of 4 children. I have personally experienced the impacts of the child welfare system on myself. I'm sorry. I wanted to use my notes, so let me just, because I want to make sure I don't leave anything out. So I have to slide the screen halfway. It's half of your, there we go. Okay. So as you see, I've experienced the impacts of the child welfare system on myself and my children. I work diligently and daily to rise above my past and create a path of success for a future for my children. So those are my children. Yolanda is the oldest one, and then Rakaya is the one in the light blue shirt. Jay Sean is the one in the dark blue shirt. And my last daughter, her name is Deasia, which her nickname is Ping Ping. In 2011, I had lost my children due to sales to undercover, trafficking, and which got me 4 child endangerment. And so I knew I loved my kids. I knew that my kids belonged with me because I was only doing that because I had a need and I just was raised that way. So nevertheless, I knew that I wanted my kids, but I knew I had to speak louder than my 6 felonies. I knew I had to clearly make a change. So through the non-support of family members and stakeholders who have impact over what needs to take place when it comes to reunifying with my kids, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of things I didn't ask because I knew I was wrong. And so I let a lot of things happen. So as time went by, I continued to put myself out there and become a part of a community instead of harming the community. I had changed my mind because I knew my children were African-American and they would be hard to adopt if I didn't change my mindset. So a few years later, I ended up doing everything I needed to do. And my children were still gone to kinship guardianship. And so once they got to kinship guardianship, I had lost my kids, even though that I continued to never miss a visit, a drug test, a class. I even went back and taught 15 more parenting classes through family preservation that I was going through, called out here on Arlington in Riverside, California. But with all that, as I do the work today, I figured it out that they were never going to give me my kids back to Southern California because of a blanket criminal history list that they have, even though that I showed up, never missed anything for my kids. But the foster parent, the guardianship lady, foster parent, she ended up filing a JV 180 and giving me my kids back because she had seen my change and she really believed in me. So next slide. So the FREE project is a 3-year project, which is funded by the Rosenberg Foundation, which is a leading edge fellowship, and is developed and coordinated through Starting Over Incorporated, which this is the year 1 of this project. So FREE addresses systematic barriers that impede on family reunification for children and people with criminal convictions. These barriers prevent people from being a foster care provider, adoption approval, family reunification services, and actual reunification with family through child custody and dependency court rulings. So FREE is working to reduce the number of children in foster care by examining current laws and policies, raising awareness of the impact that current practice have and the desperate impact current laws and policies have on particular populations. The FREE project has created a supportive network of formerly incarcerated people and their children who have faced these challenges of the child welfare system, and is working to raise awareness and to amplify the voices of children who want to be with family members who love and can care for them. Next slide. So kids in foster care, California State. So right now we have 25,442 children in California that are in resource family homes with case managers, but may have not been approved yet by resource family homes. So it's like kind of an emergency. So we have those kids in limbo. And then so out of those kids, we have 24,000 of those that are under the age of 15. So as you see in the graph, it's like 1 to 2 years. So with my case, it was 5 or more years, right, before I was able to get my kids back because of my kids languished in the foster care system. So I say this to say that we have to come up with more viable placement for them. Some of these blanket offenses are stopping people to love and care for their children. And we know that once they age out of the foster care because they're unadoptable, or they've been misplaced, or they've been, because of their skin color, they've been judged too early about, what's going to take place in their life. They're aging out with 8% of them attempting college, 3% of them finishing. The girls are 6 times likely to get pregnant than their peers. 25% of the males are already in some type of institution. And so if that's the case, formerly incarcerated people that have no crimes against children should be able to love and care for their children and get those same results as the state of California or any other state. I'm pretty sure the data could be different, but most likely it is some of the same things going on as I did in the research. Next slide. So every Friday we have Family Reunification, Equity, and Empowerment, Participatory Defence style, which has a child dependency court. So we have the goal for FREE is to support families who find themselves facing child welfare systems or child protective services, so that they have understanding of what to expect and how to avoid certain pitfalls related to family reunification. So as I was going through, I had a few family members, and there was a lot of things I didn't want to ask because the shame of it, and the guilt, how could I lose my children? And it was my fault, so maybe I shouldn't ask because I was unaware. So I really wish that I had a free hub like this when I was going through it back in 2011. So we help participants create social bio packets, which helps to show the courts who they are and beyond their social workers report, because sometimes the social worker will put, well, the parent appeared to be on drugs, you know, and we'll mistake it as that the social worker said we're on drugs, you know, and like it's not a, you know, so participatory defense on Fridays is a safe space. Everybody is more than welcome to join. We're at 321 East 6th Street in Corona, California. I also have it available through Zoom and through call because I've noticed that some of the clients that I serve are extremely poor, like we come from poverty stricken communities, and so transportation and accessories are sometimes hardship. And so we just want to show families how to create their own written records and obtain other relevant records such as school and church and medical, etc. And court support. So we'll come out and support you at court because I was there by myself, you know, so I know what it's like to get all this news or to read one of those reports. And so the juvenile dependency court proceedings, it's really crazy, right? Because if you don't know how to navigate it, you could be thinking something else and you could be moving fast and they're judging you on your actions if you care enough or if you don't care enough. You know, they're watching you. So we just want to make sure that every family, I just got an email yesterday and I had some pictures I will be sharing soon. One of our clients, Joe and Vanessa, they just received their children back. I have been working with them for the last 7-8 months. And so I'm happy for them. And then I got another parent, her visitations reinstated. She had an active warrant, so they cut her visitations off. And so we helped her, you know, get on the calendar and get things together. Now she has her visitations back. And so we want to support the family, the individual, because it is a case by case. When you're living with criminal convictions, and you have family reunification issues, you need a case-by-case assessment. And we've noticed that the child welfare does not have something that supports it to the T or to walk through or to give the parents space to grieve because different nationalities grieve different, you know, and we all can say that it feels like grieving a child that's not even dead. And so the hurt, you know, and I appreciate being a part of the hubs because I get to relive my truths every day to understand why I can move forward because I did the best that I could do and I did receive my kids back. Next slide. So why is this critical? Families and communities are unsure how they can engage in the court system and are often too passive to process. So like I was saying, there was a lot of things I just, you know, and then when family members tried to step up to get the kids, they were just, they weren't prepared for what they had to say. So we also help family members who are trying to get their loved ones out of foster care too, as well at the Participatory Defense Hubs. Family Reunification Participatory Defense Hub. So it's like military court, you know, it's so private. You can't really have, you know, a lot going on in there because it just start raising suspicion. So, so if they wish to present the court with mitigating or humanizing information that could have an impact on foster youth placement, they have few mechanisms for achieving that goal. So that's why we help them create social biographies and things like that because it humanizes them and allows them to see who they are versus to who they were. So foster youths often have their own voice minimized due to their age, and by extension, we have become a traditional amplifier for their voices and their families because some of us don't even know that we can use our voice, don't even know that we have a voice, especially being so poverty stricken and always doing things to fill a need. That's how most of us acquired our criminal convictions. Um, Next slide. So how free works. I and parents and other organizations, we come together and we'll go out to child dependency courts. We'll pass out flyers and we'll let the families know that we're here for them, that we have a safe space for them to be able to vent and not things be used against them. Community events, low-income neighborhoods. So one out in San Bernardino, I canvassed. It's called Little Africa, and it's a pretty bad neighborhood. So I can just imagine the CPS cases and the surveys that I got. Out of the 60 surveys I got, at least 45 of them were somehow connected to somebody or themselves personally with a CPS and criminal conviction as a combination. And then I also reach out to serve agencies that serve CPS impacted populations like drug rehabilitation centers, parenting class, and support groups, because it's 8 million people in California with criminal convictions, and I know their parents. So the Free Hub is only a part of Free. Other components of the project, we do community organizing. We've done some rallies. We've done some advocacy as far as going to courts and meeting with the social worker with the parents so they can have the support they need. Narrative uplift. We're lifting the narrative that we can love and care for our children, and criminal convictions shouldn't be in the way of that. You know, we love and care for our kids, and criminal convictions. Our kids, I was just telling this lady the other day, she said, you know, my daughter found me and she's really mad. And I said, you know, bring her to the hub because we can help her understand that it was a lot of these health and safety codes and welfare institution codes that kept them apart, you know, and that's where you need to direct the blame to and not to the parent, because I'm pretty sure the parent did all they can do. I mean, she's a part of our group, you know, so I know she never stopped fighting, even though her rights were terminated. And so, so she's going to bring them out this Friday. So I really look forward to that, to let her know. And plus we have other kids that have aged out of foster care, and, you know, they real emotional, you know, just a lot of depression taking place because they were thinking nobody loved or cared for them. So we're trying to uplift that narrative that, you know, you have value. It was just the child welfare system doing what they thought were doing best, you know, and just lifting up the narrative that we can love and care for our kids, because our kids would like to know where we're at, even if it is just to cuss us out, you know. Whether it be good or bad, they still like to know. And I'm pretty sure you'd like to know where your parents are too. So we do civic engagement. We're going through some, talk about that in a second though, but we're doing civic engagement. We're showing up to city council meetings. We're showing up to Sacramento to speak with Christy Wrigley and the Continuum Care. We're showing up and we're letting them know. We're letting them know that it is an alternative, because they're never gonna say, okay, so they're never gonna say that, you know, at the beginning when they take your kids, you have a criminal record, you're not gonna get your kids back, so there's no use of trying. They're never gonna sell us that. They're going to allow us to do everything we need to do, and then they're going to use it as a blanket exclusion to get the federal dollars to say this person has criminal convictions, and it's not unpacked. And so, next slide. So, creating social biographies. There are the Free Hubs, helps families and family members with criminal convictions create social biographies by writing about their personal and professional life. Through this model, families and communities rehumanize themselves and assist their attorneys in case preparations. This work increases visible family presence in the child dependency court. So it lets them know that you do have a support system. So social biographies are so important, especially in the child dependency arena, because if you're formerly incarcerated, you know, they have already have summed you up, and especially if you go in there not looking up to par, you know, if you got flip-flops on and it's cold, or your hair is a little messy, or you know, it could be a number of reasons why you look like you look showing up. But people, you know, they judge you the first 3 seconds they see you if they're gonna like you. And so when it comes to creating social biography, knowing that maybe we have already appeared in a way that they've made a thick bias lens towards us, this social biography helps deter it and show them that you know who you are versus to what you were then. You know. Next slide. So here at Family Reunification, Equity and Empowerment, for the people watching, we ask that, you know, if we can have any volunteer attorneys to support Free Hub parents. I do have one attorney that comes every now and then, and 2 retired social workers that I can lean off of. But I want to make sure I give the parents factual and sound advice, because I can only measure from what I've been through. And so any volunteer attorneys that would like to support the Free Hub parents, I ask that you get in contact with me. Like I said, volunteers to assist in outreach. I canvass low poverty neighborhoods. We do tabling at events. We sometimes we go out of town and do presentations for other states or communities within the state of California, so they can start a participatory defense Free Hub to help their populated, impacted CPS people. Partnerships with other community-based organizations to help set up new Free Hubs in your neighborhood, so people can have things to go, as well as bounce ideas off each other, make each other stronger, so we can get some real healing to the family, so they can move forward and know that they belong as a family. They deserve to be a family. Sharing of stories that will shape new narratives. So we're always looking for your story so it can be shared, so we can be able to continue to uplift the narrative, and as well see, you know, what else besides criminal convictions is the hindrance of family removal, reunification, I'm sorry. A child-centered approach to this work. What does the child want or need, and how do we minimize their trauma? So if you have any information on that, we'd like to talk with you, because we are making a book, so a tracking book. And so we just want to make sure before we go to publish that we can give out the best tidbits and the best information to keep the parent or the family member and child or children grounded in love, and not add to the trauma that they've already have received being in foster care or what took them to foster care. Next slide. So social media, please follow us on Twitter, visit our YouTube. We have some few videos. Family Reunification, Equity and Empowerment. Follow us on Facebook. That's the one that gets the most attention. I'm going to do better. And then follow us on Instagram at Free California. And then use hashtags to support us, Family Reunification and hashtag Free. So come out and support us, through social media, so we continue helping families that have been impacted by the CPS, trying to have family reunification or have children that are languishing in foster care. Next slide. So this time is for questions and contact information. So the project director name is Vanya Kaur. She's in Liberia over there right now looking at the child labor laws to see, you know, what are they doing with their formerly incarcerated. My name is Bobbi Butts. I'm the project coordinator. That is my information. And this phone number right here, you can, and if you have a general question, you can also email free@startingover. But if you want to talk to me or Vanya exclusively, you can send us an email, and you can call, and they'll turn you over to the right person to talk to. So is there any questions? Hello, is there any questions?
So I think, Layla, we're at the place, if we can open it up for questions, or if I don't know if you want to wrap up, but I think we're in a...
Great, yeah. I think maybe we'll just give folks one more minute to type in the chat box if they have questions. I see at least one person has chatted that they do have a question. So one question is how to handle the issues of participants being represented by attorneys.
So at the Free Hub, that is a question because a lot of the clients say that the lawyer comes in, they give them a thick packet this thick, and tell them just have a seat and walk off. And so what I have advised the clients to do is to take your notebook and jot down the date, the time, and the question you asked. And if you got the answer, write the answer down. If you didn't get the answer, just write down what next steps, because when you're fighting for your children, your life is like an open book, and you would want anybody to be able to read whatever page they need to read at any time. So a lot of tracking when it comes to that, because that's the only way we can hold people accountable, is to be like, on this day at this time, and this is what happened. You know, we all have short memories, and their caseloads are so heavy. And so Tim, I was reading about some other things too as well to counteract that, but maybe if they just send me an email, and we can discuss it more privately, because that's a whole nother limb.
Yeah, to add on what Bobby's saying, there's actually a lot of literature, not a lot, but there's some literature about the intersection between participatory defense and traditional legal defense. Some lawyers have critiqued participatory defense because they're concerned about confidentiality and what that will do to confidentiality if they are not just with their client. And I don't have the articles on me right now, but I really would encourage people to read some of the research around and law review articles around participatory defense. It's a massive way to subvert the privilege defenders and attorneys believe is their vertical representation of a client. Like, I'm the one that's giving you the information, versus participatory defense is the community is going to come out for the person. And as attorneys, we often get taught how to defend in a very conservative concept of defense that is really straddling this concept of confidentiality that really is our client's decision about how they want to manage confidentiality and the benefits of participatory defense. So there is literature out there, and I hope people look at it. And I see a question about law students being more helpful in this work. I've seen definitely there are not a ton of participatory defense hubs for child welfare. I think what Bobbi is doing is pretty revolutionary. There are definitely participatory defense more participatory defense work and hubs that the National Council has been doing in the criminal legal system. But law students can be really helpful in gathering information and working in typing up those social biographies, researching legal issues so that can be brought to the attention of attorneys. As a former public defender myself, having more people at the table can feel daunting, but it's good pressure and good things to do. And then I also say, when do we teach issues and students are focused on abolition versus sustaining systems? I also think, and thinking of that binary between abolition and sustaining systems, it might be helpful to think about a large set of literature on what's called non-reformist reforms. So oftentimes in teaching about abolition, you might get stuck in the circle of, but it's not going to go away tomorrow. So what do I do right now? And there's actually a lot of literature about how to have a reform that is in line with abolitionist goals. There's theories from South Africa, and most abolitionists do try to wrestle with what we call non-reformist reforms. And Marilyn writes, is there a national strategy for this critically important movement? No. So I think what we really are hoping that more people get on board to really think about doing a national strategy. The National Council has been the first national container for really building out a people-led, impacted-led group of thinking about a national strategy towards ASFA. But I would say I always hate to say no, because when you say no, you're like missing the people who are doing it. But I have not seen right now at this moment a cohesive strategy, although that's something that we really are hoping to be in spaces to support and develop. What literature do you think is the most effective for law students representing parents in these proceedings? Bobbi, do you have any recommendations for things that people should read? I think I lost Bobbi. So literature.
No, you didn't lose me.
Oh.
No, you know what you said was wonderful. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you.
Literature, I think, for law students representing parents in these proceedings. Yes, I have read When the Welfare People Come. I really would recommend Dorothy Roberts. I would recommend reading a lot of the writings of people that are impacted. So if you go to Betty's Battleground and read pretty much anything Elizabeth Brico writes, and she also writes for on Dark, Salon, Vice, really, really brilliant journalism. Dinah Ortiz has written some really great pieces. She wrote one recently in the Feminist Journal for Barnard. And I really would encourage people to read that literature because it is the most representative of what is happening on the ground. And of course, Dorothy Roberts has written on probably every piece of this child welfare landscape from like a very critical race theory lens. And then the next question is, do we think the Family First Prevention Services Act will help move this issue forward? It's a really, really, really good question. And what should we be doing in our individual states to use this act to further the movement? I think it is going to be, in its face, the Family First Prevention Services Act does not actually divest the system of its power. One of the most difficult parts of the Family First Act is that it actually, it shifts money, which is a good thing in the block grant, from just adoption to some more money in prevention. The three major places it said for services that it could give money to is parenting classes, drug treatment, and mental health services, and it places a 12-month cap on those services. Parenting is a really troubling service that was a chosen fund of the Family First Prevention Services Act because it's largely agreed to be the least effective service. And so it's hard to think of that as moving away from entrenching the child welfare system and moving away from pathologizing when you think about parenting. Drug treatment and mental health are things that people want. The 12-month cap on them, as well as the definition that this child must be at imminent risk, is two pieces of the legislation that can be challenging and can invest more in the preventive services. Most states are in a place where they are writing their regulations on how to implement Family First. I think really thinking about how could you use Family First to maybe not reinvest in the traditional preventive service model? Are there ways to, make community-based services accessible through Family First prevention? My background is in public defense in New York, which has had institutional providers, not for a long time, but much longer as an institution than many other states. One, potential arguable non-reformist reform that Family First Prevention Services Act is implementing is allowing more parent defense organizations to get funding. The complication of that is that the funding is pretty much pass-through funding. So it's going through the agency still to parent defense attorneys. And I know that parent defense attorneys are working very diligently to create MOUs to minimize conflicts. I will say it's hard to engender trust when that funding scheme exists. I spoke a lot. I think some critical things are definitely making sure that the services that are opened up are ones that could potentially be in the hands of community and not through a preventive model. I think really challenging why we have put time limits on them, really challenging the notion of vested preventive services versus vested evidence-based practices like housing, welfare as well. And I'm interested in seeing and being critical and thoughtful about the implementation of parent representation through this funding scheme. I think only time will tell, and more alignment on the vision of dismantling might give us a longer, more abolition-oriented framing for Family First. And the truth is that Family First didn't come from an abolition-oriented framework. It came from a bipartisan effort to do some limited reforms.
Was there any more questions? So the question is, how can we bring family reunification, participatory defense hubs to our community using our clinics, and how can we work with free? So you can work with free by having the same shared value of make sure children that are languishing in foster care has more viable placement. You can help as well as getting some trusted messengers in your neighborhood to go out and pass out some surveys so we can see if it is a need, and get a central location. And I can come out and show you how to start the family reunification participatory defense hub by holding a small meeting with a few of the RFA people or the stakeholders of the child welfare system out there, so people can know, because I know a lot of people are ashamed. When I talk to people, I'll talk about the CPS, and oh no, not me. And then I said, but do you know somebody? And they're like, yeah, I do. And then they'll start saying they aunt, they grandma was going trying to get their nephew. So we just gotta talk, and just contact me and we can get something started. We sure can.
And I think some ways that our organization has supported Bobbi's is providing research assistance when, you know, FREE has needed it. So to the extent that we have law students, volunteer lawyers that could provide that capacity expanding for FREE, I think that would be something that people could do. And, you know, we are definitely not geographically located next to Bobbi. I'm on the East Coast, she's on the West Coast. So it doesn't really require you to be located in California to give that type of research assistance to this really important effort.
Yeah, and I've noticed too, as I do this work, I'm helping this one lady whose children are in CPS in Nevada. And then there's another lady in Oklahoma that Erin have been trying to figure out how we can best help her. And then there's another lady in Kentucky too as well. So I'm fortunate enough to be a part of Movement Family Power, which has a network with National Incarcerated for Women and Girls, which has all the states. And so I'm able to go in and ask questions, and if I have to dig a little deeper, maybe come out to that state and see what's going on, because it's hard. You're mourning a kid that's not even dead, and so like you're gonna do drastic stuff. You're gonna say drastic stuff, and this is not the time to do it, especially when you're trying to receive your loved one, whether it be your child or a family member's child, out of the CPS system.
So I think that Layla is saying to wrap it up. Dinah, the name of the person, the author of the Feminist Journal, her name is Dinah, D-I-N-A-H, Ortiz, O-R-T-I-Z. And she's exceptional writing both in the Feminist Journal and also around. And yep, I gotta thank you. Okay, so we are really happy that we've been able to present today, and we're being told to wrap it up. So thank you guys.
Okay, and thank you for watching and being a part. And just one more thing, I just want to say you can also be a volunteer lawyer for research issues if you want to. So please contact me. Anything you think that I can do, please contact me.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. And special thanks to Erin and Bobbi as well for a fantastic presentation. Very grateful.